Good evening, everyone. We really appreciate your attendance to this event. We hope you will enjoy it. This series of lectures aims at listening to some of the most renowned language researchers in the world talk about their research and their concept of meaning. This helps us all to expand our knowledge and vision of language and communication. Now, we will present a general introduction of today's lecture's background.
Professor Chantal Melis is a Belgian researcher with long-term residence in Mexico. She is a faculty researcher and professor at UNAM. She graduated in classical philology from the Catholic University of Louvain, UCL. She holds a master and a PhD in classical letters from the University of Minnesota. Likewise, she studied the subjects of the doctorate in linguistics at the Colegio de Mexico, Colmex. Her lines or research covered the diachronic of Spanish and the relationship between syntax and semantics in phenomena of synchronous variations. She has published studies that revolve around the grammatical patterns that manifest different kinds of verbal predicates in use. So, without any further ado, we welcome Professor Chantal Melis to our series of distinguished lecturers. Welcome, Professor Chantal Melis.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Good evening to everyone. When Professor Sergio Sanchez invited me to give this talk some months ago, I understood that it was going to be an intimate sort of seminar with him and some of his colleagues. And I immediately started thinking about what I possibly could share with them that might turn out to be useful in their activities as teachers of English to Spanish-speaking students of Mexico. I later came to realize that the setting of my talk was not going to be as intimate as I had imagined, but I decided to stick to my original idea. That is to say, I continue to focus on what could be useful information when one teaches a foreign language to young adults who will not learn to dominate the new linguistic system in the same way as they acquired their mother tongue, against some of the assumptions underlying the communicative approach that has operated as a favorite paradigm in second language teaching over the past decades. Indeed, regardless of our idealized conception of second language acquisition, we can be sure that the students of Sergio and his colleagues will constantly be comparing the forms and meaning of English with those of Spanish, and they will inevitably be translating expressions as they move from a familiar language to a new one. We cannot expect them to make a clean sweep of their mother tongue. Spanish will interfere in their learning process, and the difficulties they will experience will most certainly revolve around the differences between the two systems. The differences I have in mind are structural properties on which my talk will focus. I know that I should probably have put a word of warning to this effect in my title, but I was afraid that an allusion to grammar or worse, syntax might deter a potential public of participants and might have left me all alone tonight. So I announced a talk on the meaning of events, in which I will discuss sentence structures from a syntactic point of view. And yet my exposition will be full of semantic references because syntactic structures are symbolic. They too have meaning. This cleared, let me quickly show you what I plan to talk about. I will start sharing my screen and I will ask Sergio to interrupt me at any moment if something goes wrong with the slideshow. I prefer to be interrupted orally than having to control simultaneously my PowerPoint and the box of chats. My relationship to technology is anything but friendly. So I will start sharing. Full screen mode, and I will ask you if you see the PowerPoint well.
Yes, teacher.
Yes? Okay.
Yes,
Well then, as a backdrop for my talk, I will briefly recall how many linguists today analyze clauses, paying attention to the semantics of the events denoted by the verb and to the grammatical properties of the clausal constituents that figure as participants in the described event. And I will give you a couple of examples of how English and Spanish may refer to the same kind of situation with distinct syntactic structures. Having outlined our general approach to clausal structures, I will then proceed to highlight some basic structural differences between English and Spanish. English and Spanish are Indo-European languages which share many properties because of their common heritage, but they separate with respect to a variety of phenomena which have been discussed in the literature and which I will try to bring together with the idea that having a clear picture of these differences might help our English teachers to better understand where the differences come from and might help them visualize how they could transmit this knowledge in digested and simple terms to their Spanish-speaking students. The phenomena I will treat are the following. Spanish is a pro-drop language, meaning it can build sentences without having to fill the initial subject slot with a pronoun. Enseña inglés is a grammatical sentence, unlike teaches English, which is not. Second, the pro-drop property of Spanish ties in with its definition as a flexible word order language. Indeed, since Spanish does not require to fill the pre-verbal subject slot, it can have post-verbal subjects, as in llegó mi sobrina, my niece arrived. Third, in Spanish, direct objects alternate between unmarked noun phrases and phrases marked with the preposition a, introduced, roughly speaking, when the direct object refers to a person. This phenomenon, present in many languages, but not in English, is nowadays treated as differential object marking, DOM. And we will see how DOM allows Spanish to play around with the order of the constituents without affecting the semantic interpretation of the clause. Fourth, within the paradigm of its object pronouns, Spanish shows a difference between direct object or accusative lo, as in María lo abrazó, Mary hugged him, and indirect object or dative le, as in María le dio un libro, Mary gave a book to him. By contrast, English uses the same form him for both functions, as you can see in the slide, And in this sense, as I will explain below, English does not really have an indirect object function. What English does show, contrary to Spanish, is the encoding of a semantic recipient, the father who got the book from Mary, as an accusative direct object. Mary gave him a book. Linguists now refer to this type of construction as manifesting a primary object phenomenon, which Spanish does not have. And since direct objects can become subjects of passive sentences, English, unlike Spanish, can form so-called recipient passives, in which the semantic recipient functions as the grammatical subject of the passive clause. He was given a book. And finally, I will comment on the external possessor construction as it is known today, attested in Spanish and other languages, but not in English. In this context, the possessor of a thing, normally expressed through the means of an adnominal or genitive noun phrase, as in Hebrew-grammar's vase, or a possessive pronoun, as I sprained my ankle, is separated from the possessed entity and is realized as an indirect object apparently governed by the verb. Le rompió el jarrón a la abuela. When the possessed thing refers to a body part, the external possessor construction is nearly obligatory in Spanish, as in me torcí el tobillo. So let us begin. Our point of departure for the analysis of clauses in any language lies in identifying the predicate, usually the verb, which functions as the pivotal center of the clause and around which the other constituents get organized. In Mary opened the door cautiously, María abrió la puerta cautelosamente, the verb open in English, abrir in Spanish, denotes the change of state of an entity, here the door, that passes from being closed to being open. The opener and the open thing are the arguments of the verb. The arguments of a verb are constituents that have to be expressed to form a grammatical sentence. They are necessary participants in the situation described by the verb. If an argument is omitted, as in Mary opened cautiously, the sentence feels incomplete. Something is missing. In contrast, the adverb of manner cautiously adds information that is not essential, it can be suppressed without affecting the grammaticality of the clause. As you see, Mary opened the door is a well-formed sentence. The adverb of manner is a circumstantial type of complement. Verbs are now classified according to the semantics of the event they denote, and their meaning roughly helps us to predict the number of arguments they require or subcategorize, as it is sometimes said. These numbers refer to the valency of a verb. A few verbs, mostly whether verbs, do not involve any participant. Their valency is 0. They are syntactically impersonal. Some verbs require one obligatory argument. They are known as intransitive verbs. Many require 2 arguments. the monotransitive or simply transitive verbs, and some more involve 3 arguments. They are called ditransitives. In this model of analysis, the arguments of a verb are assigned a semantic function, also called thematic role, that intends to capture the nature of their participation in the event. There still exists a lot of controversy regarding the list of these roles and their labels. For the purposes of my talk, the following commonly used thematic roles are of interest. The role of agent, referring to the willful, purposeful instigator of an action or event. The role of patient, the entity undergoing a change of state or condition. A theme, an entity undergoing a change of location. An experiencer, the sentient being that experiences an internal state. The experience may involve our physical senses, no? To hear or see something, our cognitive abilities to think of something, an emotional reaction, to fear something. The role of stimulus, referring to a person, a thing, or a situation that induces the mental state in the experiencer. And finally, the recipient, someone, usually a human entity, who gets something. The arguments of a verb also fulfill a grammatical function, which to some extent reflects the semantic function and guides our interpretation of the sentence. Languages vary as to the inventory and the properties of the grammatical functions. With respect to English and Spanish, we identify the grammatical function of subject, considered to be the primary function and generally borne by the more prominent participant or the sole participant in the sentence. Mary jumped, Mary opened the door. The function of direct object, usually given to the second argument of the verb, opened the door, gave a book. And the indirect object function, typically associated with ditransitive verb of the type like give. Although, as I have anticipated, we will have to somewhat modify our conception of the indirect object function in relation to English. Keeping semantic roles and grammatical functions separate turns out to be important, not only for the analysis of clauses in general, but also for a better understanding of some of the differences between English and Spanish. And I will illustrate this point at once with some examples. The sentences, John admired her courage and her courage amazed John, describe a similar type of event, the arousal of some internal emotional feeling in an individual named John. From the point of view of the thematic roles, regardless of how the sentences are structured, John is the experiencer and the woman's courage is the stimulus. But the syntax is different. In A, the verb admire assigns the primary subject function to the experiencer, whereas in B, with the verb to amaze, asombrar in Spanish, the stimulus appears as subject and the experiencer as direct object. Now observe how the contrast at the syntactic level imposes a different perspective on similar experiences. In A, the feeling of admiration seems to emanate from John and to project itself on the stimulus. This is so because grammatical subjects tend to associate with notions of initiative, purpose, and control over the event. Direct objects, on the other hand, typically embody passive entities that experience or suffer changes against their will, so that in B, John comes across as much less in control of his feeling of amazement. The emotion is a reaction to the impact produced by the stimulus on John. Syntactic structures have meaning in that sense. They contribute to the semantic interpretation of the sentences we produce and hear. Let us now examine a very familiar example of a difference between English and Spanish. English-like is an experiencer subject verb. The translation of the English sentence into Spanish would read, La película le gustó a Juan. Spanish gustar is peculiar. It behaves as a stimulus subject verb, but unlike asombrar, or to amaze, that we saw in the previous slide, gustar marks the experiencer as an indirect object, not a direct object. This is indicated by the presence of the clitic pronoun, the dative le, which here functions as a device of object agreement. Now, before going into the semantics of the gustar constructions, I have to say a few words about the indirect object function. Many languages lack an indirect object function or dative case. It appears that in the Indo-European family, the dative case was specifically created for human beings who did not initiate and perform actions, but participated as semantic goals in transfer type of events. This is to say, prototypical datives were semantic recipients. In a sentence like, Mary gave a book to her mother, the mother does not initiate the giving. She lies at the end pole of the event. She's affected in some way, considering that something changes in her personal sphere. A new object enters into her domain of possessions. And in that way, human goals or recipients share a feature of affectedness with direct object patients. But recipients are more active than patients. By accepting the thing, they complete the act of giving. If the gift is rejected, no transfer occurs. And once the object has moved into their region, recipients gain control over the object. They can manipulate or use it for their own ends. And these active features approximate recipients to agents. The defining property of the indirect object function or dative case lies precisely in this duality. Dative-coded participants are affected like patients, but to a lesser degree. They are active like agents, but with a lesser degree of initiation. The Spanish language exploits this duality in many ways. Datives are rampant in Spanish. I should add that the dative case fits the emotional experience as with gustar rather well, although I won't have time to elaborate on this. Our emotions are responses to stimuli in our environment that affect us internally, but we are active or agent-like to the extent that we direct our attention to the stimulus. If we don't direct our attention, the stimulus cannot do anything. And we allow the stimulus to exert its effect on our inner life in certain ways. Now, note furthermore how gustar allows for two word orders. La película le gustó a Juan le gustó la película. And Spanish speakers will probably perceive the second example with the indirect object in first position as more natural. The sentence initial position is typically reserved for the grammatical subject, the more prominent participant, the one about which the sentence predicates something. In A, the sentence is about the movie, which had the property of inducing these positive feelings in Juan. In B, on the other hand, the focus lies on John and what he felt about the movie. The second sentence structure links Spanish to genetically unrelated languages in which a similar phenomenon has been observed. A human participant in first position, as if it were the subject, but marked dative. This phenomenon is known as the dative subject construction, of which Spanish offers many examples. Let me show you another difference between English and Spanish. As you probably know, Spanish has two passives, a periphrastic be passive similar to English, esta casa fue construida en 1920, and a reflexive passive called pasiva refleja in Spanish grammars, esta casa se construyó en 1920. Passive constructions eliminate the doer of the action and promote the direct object to subject of the sentence. They are strategies used by speakers to center attention on the patient participant without mentioning the agent. Now, observe this example. Se me rompió el vaso. The breaking event, romper means to break in Spanish, is encoded in a reflexive passive, se rompió. The patient affected by the event, appearing as post-verbal subject, is the vase. But what is the first person indirect object me doing in that sentence? Spanish speakers will tell us that se me rompió el vaso expresses something akin to I broke the vase, with the difference that while acknowledging some involvement, I do not assume responsibility for what happened. The English gloss would read something along the lines of, I unwillingly broke the vase. How does the Spanish sentence trigger this reading? Well, the underlying reflexive passive presents the breaking event as a spontaneous occurrence brought about by no identifiable agent. And dative me is introduced into the scene as someone who witnessed the event and was affected by it. The so-called seme construction has been identified as one of Spanish salient features. It is very productive. And once incorporated into that structural frame, the verb comes to mean that the denoted event was accidental or involuntary. Se me quemó la carne. I accidentally burned the meat. Se me borró el archivo. I accidentally erased the file. Se me cayó la leche. I accidentally dropped the milk. Se me salió una grosería. I unwillingly said something rude, and so forth. So having caught a glimpse of the close interaction between syntax and semantics, let us now review some basic structural differences that separate English from Spanish. Unlike English, Spanish is a pro-drop language, meaning that it allows to form sentences with no constituent filling the initial subject slot. English cannot leave this position empty, and indeed so much so that when a verb describes an event that does not involve any participant, the grammar imposes the use of what linguists call a dummy subject. It rained versus llovió in Spanish. The pro-drop property of Spanish interacts with its definition as a flexible word order language, since Spanish does not require to fill that initial pre-verbal subject slot. It can have post-verbal subjects, as in llegó mi sobrina. The rules governing the postposition of subject in Spanish are extremely complex. Post-verbal subjects are more common with verbs of one argument, and in such contexts, a couple of factors motivate the postposition with some degree of regularity. Both factors have to do with placing the subject in the post-verbal slot where the direct object normally appears, because in those cases, the subject happens to bear properties, pragmatic or semantic properties that are typical of direct objects. Starting with the pragmatic side of things, in languages like Spanish and English, clausal structures tend to progress from known or given information, usually embodied in the subject, to the new information that our sentences are supposed to transmit to our interlocutors, and information that is usually contained in the verb along with the direct object. What is given comes first, novel elements follow. Hence, when a subject refers to a new entity, that is, ones that the speaker introduces for the first time in the discourse, the subject tends to be post-verbal. Additionally, the subject tends to be postposed when its referent is not a semantic agent, but rather a patient to which or to whom something happens, as in falleció el padre de Juan. John's father passed away. This makes sense, since the post-verbal slot is characteristic of direct objects, which prototypically fulfill the semantic role of a patient. Moving on, in Spanish, direct objects alternate between unmarked noun phrases and phrases marked with the preposition a. Roughly speaking, in present-day Spanish, the a marker is more or less obligatory when the direct object refers to a person, although exceptions occur. This phenomenon, present in many languages, but not in English, is nowadays treated as differential object marking, DOM. Languages vary in terms of the direct object properties that are relevant to DOM. In Spanish, the basic criterion favoring DOM revolves around a human-non-human opposition. Spanish happens to be extremely sensitive to the semantic parameter of animacy. In various areas of its grammar, human reference trigger the use of a particular syntactic pattern that differs from the one used with inanimate things. In fact, scholars have included the prominence bestowed on human participants have included it among the defining properties of the Spanish language. Let us now quickly see how DOM interacts with the flexible word order property of Spanish. As compared to Spanish, English devoid of DOM relies on its rigid word order for the correct interpretation of its sentences in many cases. Thus, John loves Mary and Mary loves John are not interchangeable because they refer to different situations. The lover, coded as subject and appearing to the left of the verb, is John in 1, but Mary in 2. The beloved ones, who may not be aware of the lover's feelings, occur in post-verbal, as direct object, the post-verbal position. By contrast, Spanish allows for the expression of sentences like, "A María la quiere Juan." We need an appropriate discourse context for this utterance. The topic of the conversation has been about Maria, and the revelation about perhaps a secret lover constitutes the new information. Independently of this, the important point is that the beloved can head the sentence, since DOM ensures the proper reading of the syntactic function and the semantic role of Maria. I mentioned earlier that Spanish has an indirect object function or dative case. One of the criteria linguists use to identify this grammatical category involves looking at the paradigm of the object pronouns. Third person reference in Spanish, generally speaking, take the form lo, los, or la, las, when functioning as accusative direct objects, as in María lo abrazó, but appear as le or les if dative, as in a sentence like María le dio un libro. Observe that the English translations of the Spanish sentences show the same him form. Surely, in the second pair, him is preceded by the preposition to, which marks the semantic role of the father as recipient in the giving event. But in strict terms, English does not really have an indirect object or dative case. The accusative-dative distinction was lost in the course of time. What English does show, however, is the much discussed alternation between Mary gave a book to him and Mary gave him a book. Several decades ago, this alternation was said to involve a phenomenon of dative shift. The supposed dative of the first clause acquired direct object status in the second clause. Note that dative was used more in a semantic sense. It would have been more correct to say that the recipient of the giving event coded in the prepositional phrase to him became a syntactic direct object. At present, the sentence, Mary gave him a book, is held to exhibit a primary object construction. The primary object phenomenon refers to the identical syntactic treatment of recipients of ditransitive verbs, as in Mary gave him a book, and patients of transitive verbs, as in Mary hugged him. Spanish has no primary object the way English does. And in some languages of the world, on the contrary, events of transfer of the type denoted by give are always expressed with a primary object. From a semantic point of view, the choice between Mary gave a book to him and Mary gave him a book comes associated with a shift of perspective. The first variant focuses on the change of location of the second argument, a book, here with the semantic role of theme, that is seen as leaving the giver's domain of possession and moving towards that of the recipient. The second structure, on the other hand, construes the give event as a scene of interaction between two prominent human participants. Now, since direct objects in English and Spanish can become subjects of passive, the Mary gave him a book alternative of English makes it possible for the recipient to appear in so-called recipient passives. He was given a book by Mary, in which the recipient accedes to the position of the profiled subject constituents on which the sentence predicates. He was given a book by Mary says something about the recipient. Understandably so, this possibility is not available to Spanish, which has no primary object. Nevertheless, observe how Spanish speakers, taking advantage of their reflexive passive, have found a way of building a passive sentence, which likewise seems to be predicating about the recipient. The starting point is an active sentence of the type, Mary gave a book to John. The reflexive passive eliminates the giver and promotes the book from direct object to subject, although in this case the syntactic promotion is difficult to appreciate because the noun phrase un libro keeps the same form and remains in the post-verbal position as is common with reflexive passives. And finally, the recipient is moved to the initial position. The result is a construction with a prominent human participant. A Juan se le dio un libro. A prominent human participant, marked dative, but collocated in the initial position as if it were the subject. The sentence predicates about the semantic dative recipient. And of course, this construction reminds us of the dative subject pattern that we discussed in relation to Gustav. Now, in contexts where the recipient is known information, the reflexive passive with give will appear as in se le dio un libro. The reflexive morpheme se is what our quasi-recipient passive shares with the accidental or involuntary event construction we examined above. The structure made up of the sequence reflexive morpheme se plus dative pronoun plus verb plus a noun phrase is very frequent in Spanish. The challenge posed by this syntactic pattern is that the semantic interpretation depends on the type of event denoted by the verb, and it requires a fine-grained analysis of each sentence. And finally, for today, Spanish differs from English in displaying external possessor constructions lacking in English, which once again involve the foregrounding of an indirect object. The alternative construals shown in the slide will help our understanding of the phenomenon. In A, the possessor of the vase, grandma, is expressed through the means of a genitive phrase, as in English, he broke grandma's vase, rompió el jarrón de la abuela. In B, on the other hand, grandma no longer appears inside the noun phrase. She now functions as a dative marked constituent, joining the direct object as if the possessor along with the patient was an argument of the verb to break. Hence the name external possessor, external to the phrase containing the possessed thing. The situation described in A and B is the same. Choosing B over A, as scholars have brought to the fore, has the effect of giving greater prominence to the impact of the event on the possessor via the feature of affectedness that is intrinsic to the grammatical function of indirect object. External possessors are extremely frequent in Spanish. In some contexts, in fact, particularly those involving inalienable body parts, the option with the possessor expressed inside the noun phrase, torcí mi tobillo, comes across as anomalous. Me torcí el tobillo is definitely preferred. And with this, I conclude my talk. I will stop sharing. I will escape. I conclude my talk. It is my hope that some of the things I presented tonight will be helpful to Sergio and his colleagues, whom I had very much in mind all along. And it is my hope too, why not, that I was able to show how syntactic analysis of languages can be sources of excitement and great intellectual pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chantal. This is truly enlightening. We could ask the public to please start asking their questions. We already have one question over here. Emma Jimenez asked, what happens with me rompí mi tobillo?
Yes, me rompí mi tobillo would be considered a case of double possessor expression, because the possessor would be in the possessive me and also in the dative. Apparently, this construction is more frequent in some Latin American countries than others. It has been suggested that this doubling may have something to do with contact between languages, with some indigenous languages. We know, for instance, that in Nahuatl, there is a double marking of the possessor, and that might be an explanation.
Thank you, Professor. We have a comment here from Jean. I think I pronounce Jean or Jan, I'm not sure. Lopez Figueroa. For me, as a native speaker of English, your delightful talk clarified difficulties Spanish learners often have, especially with like, the verb like.
I know that it's the problematic construction to teach yes, to English speakers.
Could I myself further ask something about this verb? I was wondering, Professor Chantal, Melis, when you start learning Spanish, because you, as I understand, are a native speaker of French, right, Professor?
Yes, yes.
So Spanish was not your first language. How did you come to master, so to speak, this particular verb we have here in Spanish, gustar? What was your personal experience with learning how to use it?
Well, I remember I learned Spanish at the UNAM. And I remember that one of my first impressions was precisely that there was a whole host of datives that were in first position, like they do not do in French. It's a very attention-calling feature of Spanish. You know?
Yeah.
Well, with time, of course, when now as a linguist, Spanish is my object of study. And so I have a sense of how the system works in a way that I don't have that sense with French. Because one thing is your native language, you learn and you use it without thinking. And another quite different thing is making one language your object of study. And so I remember that acquiring the use of all the clitics along with the reflexive clitic was quite a challenge.
I can bet. We have some other comments and a few questions. Another comment is, I love the talk. I think it makes us think how syntactic analysis gives us insight to understand Spanish students' interlanguage. Here we have a question from Professor Ricardo Maldonado. What about me duele mi pancita? Is there triple marking?
Triple? Why triple? I would say there's a double marking. It's me, that there's a possessive me, and there is the external possessor in the dative.
Thank you, Professor. I think Maria de Jesus raised her hand. So if she would like to turn her microphone on and ask the question directly, please. We'll wait to see if she turns on her microphone. Let me see what other questions we have over here.
La tendencia a favorecer la animacidad en la sintaxis del español es compartida por otras lenguas. Yes, I imagine that there are other languages where, in fact, the DOM phenomenon is often motivated by a distinction between human and non-human participants. There are languages where a different form is used when the locative is in a place, or when the goal of the movement is a person. We have it in Spanish, no? Me voy con la abuela. We don't say me voy a la abuela. A would be the normal preposition. Yes, there are other languages, but what calls for attention is that of course, in comparison to French, at least, I should not talk about the other Romance languages whose system I don't know as well. The Spanish is very sensitive to semantic parameters. Its grammar is less grammaticalized than in a language like English, but also less than in language like French. And since it is a flexible, it's a flexible language in terms of order. It's a flexible language also in terms of case, because Spanish can play with direct objects and indirect objects. We do it even in countries that are not called leístas. We can say, el ruido lo molestó, a Juan le molestan los niños. That ability to sometimes choose an accusative patient and sometimes a dative experiencer does not exist in French, for instance. So the semantics are all over the place. The semantics shapes the syntax of Spanish. And that's why it makes it so interesting, I think.
Thank you, Professor Chantal. We have another question here from Sandra Martin. Speaking about datives, does it have the same origin for all languages? As a native speaker of Spanish and a German learner, sometimes I find it hard to explain why in German some verbs take the dative case.
The difference between accusative and it's between accusative and dative, no, in German. Oh, what did you I find hard to explain why in German some verbs take the dative case. Yes, some have the origin in Indo-European. German has fewer dative cases than Spanish. Well, it has fewer places where the verb requires a dative. When functional linguists try to explain the phenomenon, they will say that we see that the verbs that require dative don't have really patience as second argument. Helfen, to help. You help someone. The other is not, well, he receives your help, but in some way he also has some control over you because you're trying to help him, and so you will do things that might be useful for him, no? Or another, I remember, to follow someone, to pursue. If you're behind someone, the other one is the one who's sort of controlling your movement, that you're trying to catch up with him. So sometimes looking for an explanation, we see that the datives are not prototypical patients, and that's why they might have a dative. Now, in a more formal type of approach, one would say, well, some verbs require the datives, and that's something that one has to learn, no? Just like one learns a lot of things that have to be listed in a dictionary. We cannot explain everything.
Thank you, Professor Chantal. Here is a further, I think, clarification or questioning of the initial question of Professor Ricardo Maldonado. If double marking increases effectiveness, would the diminutive increase effectiveness to a greater extent?
Yes, Of course, the diminutive has been analyzed as sort of an expression of affectedness, of proximity. And so the example that Dr. Maldonado gave us, me duele mi pancita, my tummy hurts. So it will be an intimate type of setting, and all that, of course. Yes, the affectedness of the diminutive and the affectedness of the external possessor will certainly work together. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Here we have a question from one of our colleagues, Everaldo Reyes. What is your opinion about teaching syntax from basic courses, or in basic courses, for instance, teaching the patterns some verbs have in English and compare them with those in Spanish?
Well, I'm told that there is a recognition that in second language teaching, a lot of errors are committed because of the ignorance of precisely this sort of argument structure patterns. Some teachers of German as a second language many years ago made that observation. And in fact, they were the ones who started elaborating argument structure dictionaries and so forth, because they felt that the communicative approach was fine, but there was a point in which, without knowing a little bit of how the syntax works, one does not really get to dominate a second system. And so I think that showing the differences between syntax, I know that syntax is a boo-boo word, no one wants to do syntax, but in my own experience, in my classes of Español, 3 or 4, at the university, when I started talking about argument structure, the construction of verbs, always related, of course, to the semantics, because otherwise learning to see whether there's a direct object for the sake of identifying direct object is not very interesting, no? But if you can connect it with the semantics, the students loved it. And I think that they also remember it better. Understanding where the difference come from, without exaggerating, of course, but I think that it could be very useful.
Thank you, Professor Chantal. We have here another question from Alejandra Siria Fernandez. The difference between Juan vio el accidente, Juan vio a la maestra is because the teacher maestra is highlighting the animacy of the noun or the stimulus, but this also occurs is an object is moving. For example, Juan vio a la pelota when it is moving, Juan vio la pelota when it is not moving.
Well, this preposition a started to be used in medieval Spanish and was used in more and more contexts each time, and usually because the referent was human. And it started with a very singular, prominent human reference, and then also not so prominent and not so definite and plural and so forth. But again, there are cases where Spanish speakers use the preposition a with inanimate direct objects. And there are cases where a personal direct object does not trigger a. There are entire libraries, entire lots of articles written on this alternation, this variation. People analyze with a looking glass the different contexts, trying to understand why Spanish speakers use an A where it is not expected, or don't use an A where it is expected. Because of course, native speakers will play around with this possibility, this alternation in a non-conscious way. No? The view a la pelota, understanding that the ball is moving, everyone would agree with. I cannot have an opinion on this, because these are very subtle uses of the preposition and contrast, no? Between a ball that is moving and a ball that is not moving, perhaps. Yeah, but yes, of course, there are cases where the A is used with inanimate things. And in fact, it has been said that at some point, we don't know when, all our direct objects will be marked with A. It has been predicted that this at some point would happen.
Thank you, Professor. I have a question of my own, if I may ask. I've heard some people say that the fact that we use so often these constructions of se me cayó el vaso, se me rompió, etc., reflects somehow the type of culture in which we live, a culture in which we don't want to accept responsibility. Would you agree to a greater or lesser extent with this position about the connection between culture and syntax?
Well, of course, languages are windows to culture. That is, this is certain, and we cannot negate it. The only thing is that we have to be careful with generalization about culture. It has been said that this construction of involuntary event is more common in Mexico than in Spain, for instance, because in the Mexican culture, people don't want to assume responsibility for things. What I know is that typologically, many languages have a special device, a special construction to mark the unwillingness of an event. It appears to be a human need to be able to say, yes, I did it, but it was not my intention. It was an accident.
Sorry, there was a microphone turned on.
Okay. So we use it, of course, in Mexico, but before, and it's culture in the sense that it's an expression I want to be able to use to avoid when I feel that I don't want to take on responsibility. Apparently, the experiments have been done, with children. They come with the mother, se me cayó, and the mother gets mad and said, "You mean you dropped it?" There's a perception also that people use it sort of as to get out of responsibilities that they should assume. But when I started sort of working on that phenomenon, I was surprised to find that so many languages had devices to express an accidental event.
Thank you, Professor Chantal. I think there are no more questions. Here we have, I think we have one final comment. Laura Aurora Hernández, comments. Eso se podría explicar porque en español no tenemos marcas específicas de evidencialidad y se adapta para explicarla. For people who don't speak Spanish, this could be explained because in Spanish we don't have specific marks for evidentiality, and that is adapted to explain it.
Well, evidentiality would what refers to the sources, no, the source of our information about who did it. Sources of information, where the information comes from. But in this case, I don't know if evidentiality would be the right label, because of course there are situations where it's very clear that the yo was involved. The whole thing is, will I show that that it was my fault? Will I express it as it was my fault or not? Maybe I'm not understanding the question, because I'm not sure that this particular case would have to do with evidentiality.
Thank you, Professor Chantal. We have one more question from Citlali Martinez. What's the explanation to explain the difference between por and para?
Yes, well, the prepositions, of course, are. When I talk about basic difference between the languages, I went with the syntactic differences, the structural difference, because that's a bit of my deformation. But of course, there's a world of differences, especially at the lexical level, all the prepositions that have their own meaning and so forth. Por is a preposition that comes from Latin with a causal meaning. Para did not exist in Latin. It's a formation of por, per, Latin per, plus a, plus the preposition a, which adds direction. And so para tends to be used more for finality, for I'm doing para a person, a beneficiary. Para projects what the term of the preposition towards the future, and por is more causal. Now, causality and finality, of course, are very connected, because what we want, our goals, our intentions, of course, are what motivate and make cause our actions. So they are sort of two poles of the same situation. But in general, por is a bit more causal and para more final.
Thank you, Professor Chantal. So I think that's about it for questions. There are many comments congratulating you for such an exceptional, extraordinary, beautiful presentation, Professor Chantal. I have not read them because I wanted to give priority to the questions, and yet I would like to read a couple of them that are at the end of the chat. I love the talk, so interesting and useful. Thank you. Thank you, interesting. Thanks for such an excellent presentation. So you could find all of these different comments all along the chat. So I would also like to speak out my own gratitude for the time that you have taken both to prepare this wonderful presentation and the time that you have taken this evening. This is a very special day. Today is Women's International Day, and it's not a coincidence. When we were planning the distribution of the different talks that we had, lectures that we had for this year, we thought it would be a great idea to celebrate this day, having a researcher such as yourself representing what's so special about today, Professor Chantal. So I really appreciate the whole effort that you are that you have done in order to be here. I am sure that there are people waiting at home for you to finish this presentation and join in the celebration of today's International Celebration for Women. So that could be all for you. There are some further comments congratulating you for your presentation. And that's all for today. I want to say thank you to everybody who's been here. And we'll keep in touch. Professor Chantal, thank you so much for making this happen. This couldn't happen without your disposition to be here. Thank you so much, Professor Chantal. We are all really grateful here. All the committee is very grateful with you, Professor Chantal.
Well, goodbye.
Goodbye, Professor Chantal. We'll see you.
Thank you to all the participants who listened all the way through.
Thank you, Professor. So with that, there are more congratulations coming to the chat. Si alguien quiere prender el micrófono para despedirse, if somebody wants to turn on their microphones to say goodbye.
Gracias.
Excelente.
Thanks a lot. Have a good night. Buenas noches.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Chantal. It was a very nice talk.
It was so wonderful.
I really
Thank you very
enjoy it.
much.
Thank you.
So much, Dr.
Buenas
Chantal.
noches. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Such a
Merci beaucoup, madame.
simple
De
and
rien,
friendly
de rien.
presentation.
Thank you,
Thank
and
you
thank
so
you,
much.
Sergio.
I really
Thank you
enjoyed
as
it.
well.
Goodbye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yes, thank you, Sergio.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Have a good night.
Bye.